Legislature put in long hours working on tough issues that face the state. Some of the most complex issues involve politics and religion. That's definitely the case with one of the more complex issues these past few years, faith healing.
Proponents of getting rid of this exemption have asked why it's so difficult to address the issue. But here, Monica Hopkins, former ACLU of Idaho executive director, explains the tension.
In many cases, we have looked at religious liberty and protecting religious liberty, and there is a natural tension that comes into play when we're talking about policy and protecting religious liberty. I think that tension is something that, our forefathers thought about when they authored the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Finding those boundaries between a parent's religious liberty, the child's right to life, and the public good has always been intimidating. But then there are the medical realities of faith healing. Wood River Valley pediatrician Dr. Barton Adrian, who has looked into faith healing related deaths in Idaho, put one of many instances into stark terms.
Kids who die of pneumonia basically suffocate. You can see it from across the room. So as your lungs get stiffer and full of more junk, you compensate by breathing faster, so the kid would be going.
But it's more than just pneumonia. We've reviewed dozens of autopsy reports that paint a disturbing picture of children's final moments of life. Children who died of untreated diabetes, who were severely dehydrated and hyperventilating in their last conscious moments. Children who had bed sores and pus draining from infections. Children who had unimaginable bone pain from untreated leukemia. These weren't easy or peaceful deaths. Those children suffered. We've met with members of the Followers of Christ multiple times, and while they don't want to be on camera, I can say that they do genuinely love their children. They genuinely love God. They genuinely believe in their religion. These are kind people. But none of that love or faith will change the fact that children have died painful, preventable 18th century deaths. And now, here's the legal side. First, the distinction between criminal and civil law. The legislature this year debated a change to the civil side of the law, specifically when and how judges in Idaho can intervene and order medical treatment while a sick child is still alive, even if the parents use faith healing as a treatment. But here's the thing about that. Judges already have the ability to intervene, and they do when they know about a sick child. Most of the public debate around faith healing exemptions has focused on the criminal side of the law, specifically whether prosecutors should be able to charge parents who decline to seek medical treatment for religious reasons, resulting in serious injury or death to their child. The debate, in other words, is about whether those parents can be punished if or when the child dies. While there is an Idaho criminal case law on religious freedom as it pertains to medical treatment and neglect, there are civil cases from other states. One case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court in which a deceased boy's father sued his ex-wife, the boy's mother, after she declined to seek treatment for the child and instead prayed for his untreated diabetes. The Supreme Court upheld a state appeals court decision that awarded the father $1.5 million in damages. Notably, the court said, quote, "Although one is free to believe what one will, religious freedom ends when one's conduct offends the law by, for example, endangering a child's life," end quote. Remember, that was a civil law decision. So how about criminal law? First, let's look at Employment Division v. Smith, a 1990 decision about faith in general, in which a man made the claim that he should be exempted from laws against smoking peyote because of his religion. The court disagreed. Here's University of Idaho law professor Shakira Sanders.
And so from that case comes the rule that when it comes to criminal laws and other types of laws that apply to everybody else, the First Amendment free exercise clause does not demand any type of religious exemption.
In other words, the Supreme Court ruled those First Amendment religious protections don't apply to criminal law. There's also the Idaho Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, Guarantee of Religious Liberty. The exercise and enjoyment of religious faith and worship shall forever be guaranteed. We know that part, but then there's the next few lines. While they mostly deal with polygamy, there's this key part. but the liberty of conscience hereby secured shall not be construed to dispense with oaths or affirmations inconsistent with morality or the peace or safety of the state, not to permit any person to commit the crime of bigamy or polygamy or any other crime. In any other circumstance, not seeking medical care for your injured or deathly ill child could be considered a crime. At the very least, prosecutors would have the ability to look into a child's death. But as prosecutors interpret the law right now, this statutory exemption puts an automatic kibosh on any kind of investigation at all. In 1993, Attorney General Larry Eckelhock's office issued an opinion on the constitutional question of religious beliefs versus religious practices, saying, quote, "The drafters of the Idaho Constitution recognize the importance of assuring that although there should be no limit to an individual's right to a religious belief, there were boundaries on an individual's right to religious practices," end quote. That brings us all the way back to faith healing, and whether the First Amendment or the Idaho Constitution protects the actions the followers of Christ are performing or not performing in accordance with their religion. This legislature has made it clear they're not touching the criminal side of this law, that they don't want parents to be prosecuted for inactions stemming from their faith, regardless of how many children have died. And the judicial branch can't infringe on anyone's beliefs. But it, too, has the ability to interpret the law differently and change the way it's applied. And it has a different set of obligations.
I can also see organizations who think that this law is wrong, sort of bringing a court claim on behalf of the children of Idaho and saying, hey, these kids have a right to life, and this law is essentially negates that right to life or improperly places the parent's religious beliefs or the parent's right to be a parent over that child's right to life.
But finding the right organization to sue might be difficult, as the plaintiffs must prove harm to themselves, and a dead child can't sue. Then there's the question of whether suing would affect the criminal side of the law in the first place. The state, however, has a compelling interest in keeping a child alive and could easily show harm. And that's a potential avenue for answering the question of where that line between free exercise of religion ends and the individual liberties of a child begin. In other words, if the legislature doesn't change this, the right plaintiff might. For example, a county prosecutor could attempt to prosecute the presumably unprosecutable, thereby challenging the statute. That could give us the answer the legislature would not. We'll have much more about the constitutional questions surrounding faith healing on our blog, idahoreports.blogs.idahoptv.org. On Friday, we sat down with Senate President Pro Tem Brent Hill to ask him about Tuesday's faith healing vote, as well as transportation negotiations with the House, and why the Senate has been axing so many proposals that started on their side of the rotunda. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Speaker Bedke last week. How's your session going?
Well, we thought when we scheduled this that we were going to be talking about the end of the session and what has happened. And it doesn't look like we're there to the end yet. We still have some unfinished business. So we're disappointed we didn't get done when we had hoped to get done. But, we don't have a set number of days like some states do. And I think it's better that we stick around and get it done right. We don't want to push anything through, even at the last minute, that isn't exactly what is best for the citizens of Idaho.
You say that. Why put the deadline of March 24th up in the first place if you know that there are going to be a lot of really, really important pieces of legislation come through at the last minute, like transportation and taxes and huge appropriations bills? Well, why do that in the first place?
We don't always know that. I mean, we set that target date at the beginning of the session, and it does perform certain functions. Number one, JFAC is finished setting bills 2 weeks before that target date. If we didn't have a target date, how long would it take them to get through the process there? Also, we start shutting down the committees. Our committees are closed now. Now, there are a few vital issues that have been pre-agreed upon that, if we have to open up a committee for a particular thing, we can do that. But our committees are closed down. If we didn't do that, people have lots of ideas, and instead of looking at 900 pieces of legislation, we'd be looking at twice that. So you have to have these deadlines where some things stop. the only deadline that isn't absolute there really is when do we adjourn?
Are you happy with how the session has gone so far?
Well, as with most sessions, I'm happy with the way some things have gone and not so happy with others. But you could talk to every legislator and almost every citizen that's paying attention, and they would say the same thing. We've done some really good things. I'm still very pleased with the progress we've made with our public education in the policies, but particularly in the funding of it. We did some really good things for career, technical education, STEM, the STEM Center, also higher education, particularly our community colleges. So some things are going really good. And those are things that usually take a lot of attention because they cause so much conflict. But with the plan we put together, there's not the conflict. So people have kind of just got used to, oh, that must not be a big deal. It's a big, big deal. And it really affects a lot of what's going on in the state of Idaho in almost every family.
But there are a lot of things that have failed once they got to the Senate floor. Pieces of legislation and amendments that not only were really, really big deals, but also started on the Senate side. I'm thinking the Article 5 convention. I'm thinking your tax compromise on income tax with Representative Moyle's bill. Faith healing, transportation funding, healthcare funding. So what's going on?
Well, it shows that we're not even united on one side of the rotunda, let alone on both sides of the rotunda. But I think those things have been good. We have had discussions on issues that we've actually been talking about for years. They have come to a head this year. And as a result, we actually take votes. We see how people really feel, not what they say they're feeling and so forth. We've got huge amounts of input from the public on those very issues. And the public has become engaged much more than they would have if we hadn't talked about those things. So the Article 5 Convention of States, that's something we've been toying around with little pieces of legislation for many years. This was the first actual real vote on it, to give it a test. Where do the lawmakers come down on that kind of thing? And they made it pretty clear, at least in the Senate, that they're not interested in doing anything with that right now. Now, there were a lot of reasons, and everybody had their own reasons. Some reasons were, we don't know what's going to happen with the Trump administration. Maybe we're not going to need a balanced budget amendment as bad as we did. Others think we're going to need it more. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, and probably not every two legislators had exactly the same reason for doing that. It will not be the last time we talk about those things, and may not be the last time some of those things fail.
Well, Article 5 convention is one thing, but then we have really critical needs in our state, like transportation funding. I mean, State Highway 5 in North Idaho was deemed a total loss by ITD.
Right.
And so what about these huge issues that we have been talking about for years? Transportation funding. I'm remembering that conference committee in 2015, the veto extravaganza from Governor Otter years before
You're going
that.
back a ways there.
Right, but this is not a new problem.
It's not a new problem.
This is a bill that came up from Senator Brackett, and I know he worked hard on it, but it came up in what was going to be the last week of the session, and it didn't have the votes on the Senate floor. And so should that have been handled differently?
Well, I think we could have handled it differently. It should not have come up the last week of the session. Part of the trouble with some of these complex bills is there's so many people with so much input, and you think you got it, and then somebody comes with another idea. Well, let's try this and let's try that, and then you negotiate. Well, I don't like that. Let's take it back out. And so the bill kept evolving and evolving, and finally we actually did say, "Hey, Bert, this is it. Let's run what we got." And we ended up doing that, and it ended up failing. Since that time, I know that there have been a lot of people working, particularly with those who were not willing to support it, to find out what are the objections. Well, what if we changed this? Well, what if we changed that? And then you got to go back to the ones who did support it and say, okay, if we do change that, are you still in support? And I think a lot of work has been going on that just in the last few days to see if we have the votes to pick that up on both sides. Now, it won't be the same bill, but it will have some of the same aspects and some of the same funding that is so badly needed. And I think there's a good chance we can end up with something.
We mentioned faith healing as well. Are you happy with how that debate and conversation went?
Certainly happy with the way the debate went. Anyway, anyone who watched the debate could see that we had lawmakers who were anguishing over that decision. We had Senator Dan Johnson, who put countless hours into not only co-chairing a working group during the interim, but working with the community of faith, with the followers of Christ. Also, trying to come up with just the right combination, and do we want to go into the criminal part of things or only in the civil part? And I think we gained understanding. I think the debate, the relationships, what went on, I just think that understanding was gained. And even though no legislation came out of it, we have set the groundwork. We have set a foundation to understand the issue better and to make the proper adjustments that we need to in the law.
You mentioned all of the people who were at the table, but one of the groups you didn't mention were people who were in favor of changing the criminal side of the law, and people who have left the church, and people who have been very, very critical of faith healing and this exemption in Idaho law. Were they part of the conversation?
Oh, yes, I believe they were part of the conversation. I know I had personal conversations with them, and I know that Senator Johnson had conversations with them, and there were several of them who testified in committee on both sides of this issue. For someone looking in, this seems black and white to a lot of people. Whenever you take rights, some basic rights that you hold sacred, and then try to mesh them when they appear to be in conflict, I don't even know if the right words exist to make it work. I mean, the right to life. What greater right can there be there? But we also value, the rights of parents. Religious rights. We hold those sacred as well. And so coming up with just the right combination is not as easy as it sounds. Even though you may hold life as the most important right, what can you do in the statute that actually is going to help preserve that life? Because if the state doesn't know about what's going on, and doesn't have a way to find out, how can they intervene to save life? And is criminalizing this so that you're taking parents who are otherwise good parents, providing for their children, providing them with spiritual, emotional, as well as economic security, and you put them in jail or in prison because of a situation that happened in their family. Is that really accomplishing what is best for society, what is best for that family, what is best for those children? So there's just so many factors to consider, and it's not as black and white as we'd like it to be, even though for some people it is. We got to consider all of those points of view, and I think that we tried to do that. We weren't successful in coming up with just the right piece of legislation, but again, the understanding is helpful. Senator Johnson talked early in the process. He kind of compared it with, we got a light here under the bushel, going back to a scriptural metaphor there. I think perhaps we have lifted the bushel some, and there's greater light there. The light is starting to shine forth, and as we illuminate the issue much better, both sides are going to be able to understand it better, and I think we will see some better solutions at least coming down the road.
You've mentioned the importance of civility and reaching understanding, but this is also a session where, like we said, a lot of ideas have failed on the Senate floor. Are we confusing civility with the importance of getting things done? Are we putting civility ahead of good governing?
Well, it depends on what the alternative to civility is. If the alternative is bullying, if it is intimidation so that you get things done, that gets things done in the short term, in the short run. But it doesn't lend itself to getting things done that the people need done over the long haul. And so it's relationships, it's trust, it's understanding, it's knowledge. Those things are what if we have those things, we have a better chance of coming down and making good choices than if we don't have those things. If we're voting for something just because somebody threatened us or somebody bullied us, and said, you got to do this, and if you don't, you're going to have these consequences. That, again, will get things done, but I'm not sure it gets the right things done, depending on which side you're on, but also it doesn't lend itself to doing the people's business in the long term in a logical, efficient, effective, and productive way.
On the House side, there's been a lot of coverage about some of the drama going on there, but they are also having these debates out in public, and they're getting their